And today, as we are finishing Black History Month, I am delighted to welcome our guest speaker today. Shauna Ashiro is a soprano who has performed throughout the DMV region, including the Handel Choir in Baltimore, the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra, the Coalition of African Americans in the Performing Arts. She is a licensed, board-certified musical therapist. She's executive director of Halo Incorporated, and she uses barbershop singing as a framework to build community and address racism in the United States and around the world in their program, Race and Real Talk. So today I give you Shauna Ashiro.
To the words of important African American women of that history. And the first thing that came to my mind was the idea that this is a history constantly in the making. And that the leaders we celebrate today were in their time the answered prayers from decades and centuries before. This also means that generations beyond today, if humanity survives to see it, people will hear the echoes of our voices calling back to honor the ancestors and calling forth to them, the descendants of our hope. This trajectory of life and faith unending reflects the structure of call and response that has carried through the tradition of what we call Negro spirituals. We in the present are always in dialogue with what has come before us and what will inevitably come after. And what comes after will answer according to the responses we choose as our call. And it was this song, Let My People Go, that resonated with me as the demand that people in this country and all over the world are starting to sing together again. Shaken by the uncertainty that befell us from a treacherous pandemic that shattered the shell of distractions we clung to in order to mute the unfulfilled desires of our souls, denied by the structures of capitalism and white supremacist patriarchy to which we have so many of us unconsciously submitted our collective power. And it is both my belief and my observation that these systems have distorted all our views of ourselves and our place in the world, including those in positions that represent the greatest power we have erected over us as a people. This belief that power is a finite resource to be reserved for the few has resulted in divisions and civil animosity that has been to everyone's detriment. Because as my aunt wisely admonished me to understand from a very young age, you can't poison half the river. Any and all harm done to one is done to all, and any and all true good done for one is done for all. We always have the power of choice to abandon the delusions of separatism so that we can choose true good together. So standing before you today, it is my intention to share some of the calls and responses from African American women whose imprints on our society have demonstrated the mantle we can all take up to reclaim that power and the time we have to use it to reveal the light of love and truth that has always held our families, our communities, our country, our entire planet together. This feels to many of us both a critically dire and a profoundly inspiring moment in time for more and more of us to do so, as the opportunity for our song of freedom to be sung, heard, believed, and heeded will not last forever. The first call that rang forth to us that we will consider today came from Sojourner Truth, who spoke these words in 1851, addressing the attendees of the Ohio Women's Rights Convention. Halting an uproar of chaotic heckling from the flustered white men who believed on the authority of their biblical interpretations of justice that white women were less than worthy of the liberty of suffrage, while Truth herself and other women of African descent were not even worth any of their consideration. She stands up and says, "May I say a few words? I want to say a few words on the matter. I am a woman's rights. I have as much muscle as any man and can do as much work as any man. I have plowed and reaped and husked and chopped and mowed, and can any man do more than that? I have heard much about the sexes being equal. I can carry as much as any man and can eat as much too if I can get it. I am as strong as any man that is now. As for intellect, all I can say is if women have a pint and men a quart, why can't she have her little pint full? You need not be afraid to give us our rights for fear we will take too much, for we can't take more than our little pint of whole. The poor men seem to be all in confusion and don't know what to do. Why, children, if you have women's rights, give it to her, and you will feel better. You will have your own rights, and they won't be so much trouble. I can't read, but I can hear. I have heard the Bible and have learned that Eve caused man to sin. Well, if woman upset the world, do give her a chance to set it right upside again. When the lady has spoken about Jesus, how he never spurned a woman from him, and she was right. When Lazarus died, Mary and Martha came to him with faith and love and besought him to raise their brother. And Jesus wept, and Lazarus came forth. And how came Jesus into the world? Through God who created him and woman who bore him. Man, where is your part? But the women are coming up, blessed be God, and a few of the men are coming up with them. But man is in a tight place. The poor slave is on him, woman is coming up on him, and he is surely between a hawk and a buzzard. Sojourner Truth was one of many women whose inner voices resonated in the hearts of Americans for centuries, documented or not. And in a speech, she entreated these men for the sake of everyone's well-being, that those with the power to bestow liberties to a people would abandon the fears that would keep them from doing so. Standing to speak in a room full of men and women who, in their respective senses or of personal interest, were practically blind to Miss Truth's existence as a whole human being. And yes, by the way, many have accepted the narrative suggested by that bronze statue in Central Park of Miss Truth constructing these ideas in concert with the likes of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. But the truth is that because Democratic leaders who opposed the emancipation of African descendants were so loath to see the black man have a voice in democracy, for he would represent their primary source of exploited labor, those leaders intentionally divided the alliance between white women and those black folks who had escaped slavery by convincing them that the suffrage of the black man would mean white women's continued disenfranchisement. And as a result, these women, Anthony and Stanton's concern for the human beings they'd once fought alongside for their freedom was molded into racist disdain as repugnant as any slaveholders. So then in the setting of the Ohio Women's Convention, arranged for like minds to come together for a noble cause, but managed to disregard the vast extension of their civil network that Sojourner Truth represented, that cause somehow became dominated by a small but critical mass of boisterous voices of tyranny who could not reconcile the demands that they let their own people go forth to share this power, because they had such fear that in sharing that power, they would lose it for themselves, and with that, their sense of identity. When in fact, it is the release of those false identity constructs that would set them free at last. And just one humble but stern voice of truth cut through all their noise and brought this room to a hush, speaking the impenetrable principle of life, that everyone's fullest freedom, not to be confused with personal indulgence and pride, is the only key to everyone's freedom. Generations later, the rumblings of toil and strife and resistance burst forth through the cry of yet another woman whose name even I've only learned as an adult, but whose work and words inspired one of the most famous speeches ever given in history. It was Dr. Pravia Hall whose prayer inspired the legendary I Have a Dream speech, and it is her sermon, A Nightmare in Broad Daylight, that we can hear both a response to Sojourner Truth's poignant admonishment to grant all women their share of agency, as well as a call to us now, in a world weary with sickness of body and soul, to follow in the footsteps of so many Black women, known and unknown, and love our people back to health. She reads from Ephesians chapter 4, which I quote not to present religious theology to anyone, but rather to provide the context of her message. I, therefore, the prisoner of the Lord, beseech you that ye walk worthy of the vocation wherewith ye are called, with all lowliness and meekness, long-suffering, forbearing one another in love, endeavoring to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, even as ye are called in one hope of your calling, but unto each of us is given grace according to the measure of the gift of Christ. Wherefore he saith, when he ascended up on high, he led captivity captive, and gave gifts unto mankind. He that descended is the same also that ascended far up above all the heavens, that he might fill all things. So then Pravia Hall goes on to say, there is in these last minutes of the 20th century a horrendous image that haunts my spirit and hounds my mind. It is a nightmare in broad daylight. It is the spectacle of young people, usually Black, but as Jonesboro, Arkansas found out, not always. Usually male, but not always. Filing past television cameras, manacled, cuffed, chained, dragging leg chains. As they file past the television cameras, we can see that they are getting younger and younger and younger. We now struggle to stifle the screeching scream as it makes its way past our constricted vocal cords as we ponder the terror of babies killing babies. And as I ponder this nightmare in broad daylight, an even more troubling question plagues my spirit. Who are they to you? And who are you to them? Dr. Hall went on to describe how this inquiry and the scripture and heart-wrenching image which inspired it sat with her over a couple of years. And after meditating on its call to her, she discovered within herself that as an African-American teaching and preaching woman, she aligned with the legacy of Black women, some known to many like Sojourner Truth, and most known only to the few whom they served with their own hands, like my grandmother. Their dedication to the arduous work of ensuring the survival of their people and their children in a world that was postured to attack and eradicate them until all that was left were bodies to exploit for the country's gain and no spirit remaining to resist that exploitation and abuse. These women inspired the men of their communities to take on the same struggle as she did so notably in uttering a prayer outside the remains of her congregation's church, burnt down by members of the KKK, where Dr. King was present to hear her repeat the words, I have a dream, I have a dream, I have a dream. These women, like Dr. Hall, like Ms. Truth, like my grandmother, and like so many of the women you've passed on the street, so many of the women who are sitting in this room, serve not only in prayer, but in the up-close and personal, nitty-gritty service of love, tending to the sick, the injured, and the grieving families of their communities who suffered at the hands of injustice. Cleaning the houses of tired single mothers and teaching them and their children how to read and write. She asked herself then, seeing the work of love and the scripture that whispered so loudly in her soul, why, if Christ has fought the duel with death and won, why are there so many captives? And if perhaps you're not a religious person, but one who believes in the ideals of this nation, you could rephrase the question as, why, when so many people have fought and died for freedom to be ours, are there still so many captives? Why are there people diligently working over 40 hours a week who are still unable to make ends meet and build a staircase that would help them reach the American dream? Why have so many others lost interest in work at all, succumbing to disempowerment from the disembodiment of their soul's joy, for which there is no room in a world running on the fumes of capitalism? Why are women being forced to return to work often less than 2 months after bringing new life into the world if they want to keep the jobs they need to contribute to their families and feel fulfilled? Why do so many of the ones who get to stay home have to do it alone? Why are children being collected into cages, separated from their parents and families? Why are we still hearing about innocent African American men being abused and killed by civilians and officers? Why is the same happening to African American and indigenous women, and all we hear is silence? Why are poor white people losing livestock and becoming sick because the government officials declared it safe to burn off a spill of toxic liquid gas and send people back home 2 days later? Why? Who are they to you, and who are you to them? Well, somebody's kept the hawk and the buzzer fighting on the ground instead of watching from the sky. Because if enough of us were aware of how all our freedom and safety is at stake when we submit our energy, our creativity, our power to some folks behind a curtain to make decisions while we are busy complaining about what's wrong with the world and bickering over socially constructed differences, they would have to yield to our demands. They would demand it of themselves and all of us as well if they realized that those curtains that conceal them drape the windows of the house that we all share. There is no reason for anyone in a free country to be subject to any of those injustices or the countless others there's hardly time to list. There's no reason. We can't face one another because the red lines that divide our neighborhoods and the red lines that shoot through our eyes when we're too tired to care have made us unrecognizable to each other or ourselves. We must all take heed to the legacy that Sojourner Truth, Dr. Pravia Hall, and thousands of other Black women have sung to us, and pay attention to the freedoms that are threatened not just within our personal purview, but all around us, because we are as connected to each other and that radical truth as any of those women who lived their lives in their knowing sacrifice because they had no choice. Let's live our lives, lifting our voices together with harmonies of liberty to answer a call that cannot be ignored. We have to let our people go. We must let go of the old pharaohs, the old systems that hold us captive so that we can open our arms and our hearts to make space for the wisdom and service of love to reign. Thank you.